When the Nikon Z6 Mark III was released, I was testing it and also comparing it a bit to the Nikon Z8. And my recommendation for most people was quite clear. Get the Z8 if you can afford it. Because to be honest, the differences in price were not so big, but the Z8 had several features that the Z6 Mark III was just lacking in my opinion. But now this has changed a bit. Nikon provided several firmware updates, both for the Z8, but even more for the Z6 Mark III. And with many features, they are now very comparable. The Z8 might have still some advantages, whereas the Z6 Mark III has other advantages. They are more comparable cameras, but in terms of price, they actually are more farther apart than they were when the cameras were released. While both of them dropped a bit in the price, the Z6 Mark III dropped more significantly. And in the video I want to highlight the differences and give you a recommendation, maybe which camera you should choose, a Z6 Mark III or a Z8, or if you already have a Z8, should you spend the extra money to buy a second Z8 as a backup camera, or can you just use a Z6 Mark III as your second body just as well? Since I mentioned the price in the beginning of the video, I want to start with that. So at the moment, the Nikon Z6 Mark III is listed for $2,200 US or 2,180 euros in the Nikon store. The Z8 for $3,800 US or 3,600 euros. Of course, these prices may change over time. I put the links of the cameras down below anyway if you want to have a look how much it costs at the moment or order it directly. One thing that definitely doesn't change over time is the body of the camera. As you can maybe see, the Z8 is a bit larger, and if you lift it up, you also feel that it's clearly heavier than the Z6 Mark III. The Z6 Mark III weighs 760 grams, whereas the Z8 weighs 910 grams. And especially if you go on hikes or want to be lightweight, this difference is noticeable. However, it also comes down to personal preference, which kind of body style or type you prefer. If I shoot with these rather lightweight telephoto lenses from Nikon, such as the 400mm f4.5, maybe a 70 to 200mm or the 600mm f6.3, I actually prefer the body of the Z6 Mark III. I just think it's more balanced and it gives me an overall more lightweight combination. However, I actually think the Z8 feels better, at least in my hands, and if I shoot with a rather large telephoto lens, such as the 400mm 2.8, the 600mm f4, or also the 800mm f6.3, I would rather get the Z8, just in terms of how it feels. Another really cool thing about these two cameras is that the button layout is very similar. So I think the biggest difference that I can see on the first glance is that the Z8 has this, I would call it digital mode dial or the mode button, whereas the Z6 Mark III has the more traditional mode dial that you can turn around here. You can also lock it if you want to avoid that you accidentally change it. Both have a shoulder display. The one of the Z8 is a bit bigger, but both have the shoulder display. The two command dials are also in the same spot. The record button, ISO button, exposure compensation button are also exactly in the same spot, and also from the back it's almost the same camera. And I'm just saying that because this means that you can quite easily use them side by side. For example, if you already own a Z8 and you want to get a second camera in case the Z8 fails, you drop it during your holidays or whatever, or just because you are sick of changing lenses all the time and you want to have one lens attached to one camera, I think the Z6 Mark III can be a really interesting option to complement the Z8, just because the button layout is so similar that you can configure the cameras that kind of 99% of what I do in my day-to-day use is exactly the same for these two cameras. Now let's get back to the differences, because one difference is hidden here below the body cap of the cameras, and you can see that the Z6 Mark III, you can see the sensor directly, whereas for the Z8 it's hidden by a sensor shield. And obviously I prefer to have this sensor shield, because sometimes as wildlife photographers we need to change lenses in situations when it's a bit rough out there. There is maybe some sand blowing around, or just in general there is dust, and this avoids that dust can enter the camera, and the sensor shield goes down basically immediately. So if I turn the camera on and now I turn it off, you can see that it goes down immediately, so you're instantly ready to change the lens without getting any dust on the sensor. And this is a unique feature of the Z8 and Z9. I don't know any other camera that has this mechanism. If we look at the back of the camera, there are also some differences. You can see the viewfinder is designed a bit differently. However, both viewfinders have a magnification of 0.8, but the viewfinder of the Z6 Mark III has a higher resolution of around 5.8 million dots, and it's also marketed as the brightest viewfinder of Nikon cameras. And the Z8 has a bit an older viewfinder with only, I think, 3.7 million dots. So you can see the difference if you look through the viewfinder, especially when you have some text like the shooting information. However, I found that the actual live view looks pretty similar on both cameras. And just for fun, I picked up my Canon R5, and this one seemed noticeably sharper. And these ones both seem a bit low resolution when I look at the actual image, at the actual live view. It's not bad, and it's a nice and large viewfinder, but in my opinion, I would not say that the Z6 Mark III viewfinder is really better for what I do than the one of the Z8. What I noticed as well is if I was doing a series of shots and I was panning quickly, that the Z8 viewfinder seemed a little bit more responsive. This might also be due to the sensor, to the stacked sensor. I will get to that later. Both cameras use the same battery, although officially the battery should last a bit longer on the Z6 Mark III, even though I found that the differences were not dramatic. Coming back to not the viewfinder but the monitor below, both have a 3.2-inch screen with 2.1 million dots. It looks very similar. However, the mechanism to tilt it is a bit different. So for the Z8 you can take it out like this and then go up or go down, or for vertical also go up like this or down like that. This makes it very easy for me if I'm shooting over the screen and I want to take pictures of waterfowl. I have the camera in a low angle. It makes it very easy to find the bird because it's kind of on the optical axis. On the Nikon Z6 Mark III, you need to tilt it like this out, and then it's not on the optical axis anymore. It's also slightly, if I exaggerate, a bit like this. And it makes it a bit harder to find the bird, I think, especially if you're a beginner and you're dealing with a prime lens. On the other hand, this has the advantage that you can flip it out like this in case you want to do a selfie or record yourself. I need this, for example, for filming myself right now, but might not be relevant for you. What I really like about this display design is that I can somehow like put it inside and then it stays protected against bumps or scratches or whatever, and it also helps to save battery because 99% when I'm using the viewfinder, I actually put the screen inside, because if I quickly want to change my settings, I always have the shoulder display on the top that I like to use. Both cameras have two card slots, one CF Express Type B and one SD card slot. I would highly recommend using the CF Express Type B slot because it's just so much faster, and especially for a bit larger cards, it's actually cheaper than SD cards, and I linked my favorite cards below if you're interested. So both of these cameras shoot up to 20 frames per second when using the electronic shutter. On the Z6 Mark III, if you use the mechanical shutter or first electronic curtain, I think you'll go back to around 14 frames per second. I have not used this much. I will get to this in a minute. The Z8 only has an electronic shutter. So 20 frames per second as a maximum, and I wanted to see how big the buffer is. How many shots can I take in a certain time frame? This is for me the most important measure, not how long does it take until the camera gets slower, but in 20 seconds, how many images can I take? So theoretically, if the buffer would not be a limiting factor at all, with 20 frames per second, in 20 seconds of shooting, I should be able to record 400 images. So the first test that I was doing with both of these cameras was in the high efficiency star RAW format, just because I use this basically all the time for years shooting with Nikon cameras, and actually both managed to achieve the 400 frames. So neither of them hit the buffer in these 20 seconds. I picked 20 seconds because this is just for me. I cannot remember a scene where I was shooting more than 20 seconds in a row. I switched then to the uncompressed RAW. The Z6 Mark III again managed 400 frames, so without any slowdown. The Z8 slowed down a bit, but it still managed to get around 340 images, so still a very respectable performance. Since I assume you don't need 20 seconds of continuous shooting a lot, and maybe for these situations, even if you prefer the uncompressed RAW, I would suggest just to switch to the high efficiency star RAW. Of course, if you shoot high efficiency without the star or JPEG, buffer will not be an issue at all. Speaking about JPEG, both of these cameras offer this pre-burst, pre-capture feature, but unlike most of other modern cameras nowadays, these two only offer it in JPEG mode and not in RAW, and therefore, to be honest, I was just not using it. Both cameras also have an IBIS, an integrated body image stabilizer, a VR, and the one of the Z6 Mark III is a bit more modern, and it allows two stops more of vibration reduction compensation, especially in the center or wherever you have your autofocus point. So the camera can prioritize stabilization to where the autofocus point is, which is a neat feature on this camera. The older Z8 does not have this. However, for shooting with telephoto lenses, I don't find this so relevant, and I was happy with the performance of both of them. One big difference that we have between these two cameras is definitely the sensor. So the Z6 Mark III offers a partially stacked sensor, whereas the Z8 has a stacked sensor. The stacked sensor of the Z8 means we don't have any rolling shutter issues at all. This is why Nikon didn't even include a mechanical shutter in this camera anymore. With this partially stacked sensor of the Z6 Mark III, I didn't have problems of the wings being distorted of birds that were flying or something. I was even taking some pictures of dragonflies at the pond in the garden of my parents, and I also had no issues with rolling shutter, except in very few selected frames, but it was usually when the dragonfly was kind of starting to change direction, and these were not the nicest images anyway, so this was not even so much of a limiting factor for that. Where I definitely saw the rolling shutter, however, was when I was panning, also with a short shutter speed, just at the background, if I had some vertical structures like trees or reeds, that they were starting to tilt. And that's a typical behavior of a camera that doesn't have a, I would say, properly stacked sensor. It's not dramatic, but you will see it if you have these vertical structures in the background. And I also found, as mentioned in the beginning, that the viewfinder seems a little bit more laggy, and you can actually see this, this kind of rolling shutter already in the viewfinder. The Z6 Mark III allows a shutter speed of 1/16,000th of a second as a shorter shutter speed. The Z8 can do 1/32,000th of a second. I'm not sure if this is relevant for you. For me, this was relevant when I was shooting with a large aperture lens, like a, I don't know, 70 to 200 millimeter 2.8 or 400 millimeter 2.8 in rather bright light, backlit with some bokeh in the background, and I could imagine it gets even worse with the 135 millimeter 1.8 planar lens. For me, usually the 16,000th of a second of the Z6 Mark III was enough, but I am happy to have the Z8 that has a bit more, well, one stop more basically of latitude, so you can still shoot in conditions that are one stop brighter. Finally, regarding the sensor, the Z6 Mark III is a 24 megapixel sensor, the Z8 a 45 megapixel sensor. I'm only mentioning this now because to me this is not the most important difference between these two cameras. Yes, the Z8 definitely gives more details. It allows you to crop a bit more if everything is fine in terms of other conditions. However, if you increase the ISO more, if you shoot a lot in low light, in my opinion, the Z6 Mark III has an advantage. The images look much cleaner. Of course, you can always denoise the images of the Z8, but I think here both have their advantages and disadvantages. And for me personally, using the Z6 Mark III, the 24 megapixels would not be a deal breaker. In fact, over the last week or so, when I went out and I decided which camera should I pick, I thought more about some other things like features of video that were the two differ, or the as mentioned, the not having any rolling shutter with the Z8, but it was not so often the megapixels that were relevant for me. So the thing that I really didn't like when the Z6 Mark III was announced almost 1.5 years ago was that it didn't have this dedicated bird eye detection mode. And when the bird was relatively large in frame, this was not an issue at all. But when it was smaller in frame, the difference between the Z6 Mark III and the Z8 was really, I would say, more than noticeable. It was drastic. And I was really hoping for this firmware update, and finally in, I think, August 2025 or beginning of September 2025, Nikon provided us with this firmware update. So it also has now this bird eye detection, and I felt that now they are almost on par. I, in some situations, had the feeling that the Z8 might still have a small edge, but I would say this is not something that would change my decision at this point. Nikon also introduced another cool feature, first with the Z8 in June and now as well with the Z6 Mark III, and this is the focus limiter. And this is especially relevant with Nikon cameras because the Nikon lenses, such as for example the 400mm 2.8, they only allow you to set the focus limiter for the distance that is farther away. So the 400mm 2.8 has a minimum focus distance of I think 2.5 meters. Obviously goes until infinity, and you can set the focus limiter to 6 meters to infinity. But unlike many Canon or Sony lenses, you don't have a setting of 2.5 until 12 meters or something, which would be nice sometimes for birds in flight, dragonflies in flight, and so on. So here this feature comes in really handy. I think it's very well done. You can really set, I think in 10 centimeter values basically, how you want to set your focus limiter. You can activate it, deactivate it with with a touch of one button. And if you want to learn how to set this focus limiter and learn more about the autofocus system of basically all Nikon Z cameras, then please have a look at the ebook that I wrote with my friend Nicholas Stettler. In the ebook we go through the different settings of the camera that are related to autofocus, explain what they do, and in which situations we would maybe change the parameters slightly. Another feature that the Z8 had from the beginning, but it was recently added to the Z6 Mark III, is to register and recall specific shooting configurations. So this can be shutter speed, aperture, ISO, exposure compensation, metering, autofocus, and I think even the drive speed, so which frame rate you have. And then you can just recall these functions with the press of one button. It can be pretty much every button on the camera. And this can be really cool if you are taking pictures of birds that are just not doing much. You have maybe a bit of a longer shutter speed to keep your ISO down, and then with the press of one button you can switch to another configuration where you have a faster shutter speed, maybe different autofocus mode, maybe a different frame rate, and so on. And this has always been here for the Z8, but now the Z6 Mark III got it as well. Finally, there are a few differences in video mode. For example, the Z6 Mark III can shoot up to 240 frames per second in full HD, whereas the Z8 is limited to 120 frames per second. However, if you shoot 120 frames per second in 4K, the Z8 can do it using the full sensor, whereas with the Z6 Mark III you have a quite heavy crop. I'm not going into much more of the video because I didn't use it enough to really have a good solid opinion about it. So I hope this video was helpful for you if you were hesitating between which of these two cameras you want to get, or if you already have the Z8, is it worth to spend a lot of money to buy a second Z8 as a backup, or are you also good with the Z6 Mark III? And I think in many situations, at least if you want a backup body, yes, The Z6 Mark III is a great option because, as I mentioned, the button layout is so similar that they feel like almost the same camera once you have them in your hand, and this is really a big bonus. If you are deciding between these two, you only want to buy one camera. I think budget is of course a relevant factor. If you want the best out of the best, I think the Z8 it feels a bit nicer, it is a bit sturdier, and especially if you shoot a lot of action, with this one you can really be sure that you don't have any issues with rolling shutter. However, I think the Z6 Mark III is still an amazing all-rounder and probably the best, bang for the buck in the Nikon setup at the moment. If the video was helpful, give it a thumbs up, leave a comment if you have any additional comments or questions, and as I mentioned, I linked both of these cameras and some CF Express cards that I like to use down below.